Hello everyone, I'm Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary ideas and more to help you become a literary expert. So if that sounds like what you need, make sure to hit the subscribe button below. So in today's video, we are looking at the context of Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which is arguably one of the most popular works of contemporary literature today. And if you're watching this video, it's probably because you are studying it at school. So I hope that this will be useful for you. Now, one reason why Handmaid's Tale has hit the canonical jackpot, so to speak, is that it lies smack in the intersection between feminist, dystopian, political, and allegorical fiction. And the fact that Atwood is a master of stylistic prose would qualify it as literary fiction as well. This is really a novel where you can get the maximum bang for your intellectual buck. So a great book all around. While it's definitely possible to read Handmaid without paying too much attention to the historical and socio-political background, and to simply appreciate it as this cautionary tale against reducing humans to their base utilitarian value, framing the novel within the broader contexts of second-wave feminism, 1980s religious conservatism, the rise of autocratic regimes, as well as the tradition of dystopian and witness literature, would indeed make our interpretation that much richer. So having a list of real-world parallels to the fictional dystopia of Gilead and Handmaid can also give us a useful framework to read the novel in an allegorical light, which has always been an instructive approach to reading canonical works, not least texts like the Bible, in which you've got all the allegorical parables, John Milton's Paradise Lost, or even down to George Orwell's 1984 and William Golding's Lord of the Flies. So, in the rest of this video, I will be analysing with reference to specific moments in the novel what I see are two dominant contextual threads that overarch Handmaid, which are namely the politicization of religious ideology in 1980s America and the religiosity of political regimes throughout human history. So with that, let's dive straight into our context overview. Growing up in 1950s Canada, Atwood was brought up in a cultural milieu where more women started shifting away from the archetype of a full-time homemaker, what Betty Friedan in her feminist mystique called the cult of domesticity, and embraced the independent persona of a college-educated career woman. Atwood herself had studied for a master's and doctorate at Harvard, so even if she herself didn't identify as a card-carrying feminist, as reflected in her caginess about the term in interviews, she was definitely someone who embodied the persona of a post-second wave feminism woman, one who was independent, intellectual, and self-empowered. As such, the revivalism of moral traditionalist ideas in 1980s America about traditional gender roles, the subsequent growth of evangelical power factions which sought to overturn abortion rights and barred the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, and the popular reception of the conservative Reagan administration in 1984, would naturally have fostered anxieties about the possible regression of women's rights for someone like Atwood. With the growing support of evangelical organizations like Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition formed by pastors like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, it became increasingly clear that religion itself wasn't so much the problem as it was the politicization of religion that undermined women's rights and drove a wedge between the two genders. Specifically, pastors with a rapidly growing base of followers untapped a goldmine of political capital by leveraging the ritualistic procedures and ecclesiastical markers of institutional religion, which worked to get a lot of people in line with a singular belief. Ideas like a blanket ban on abortion, even in the case of rape or incest, the superiority of stay-at-home mothers over professional working women, and the validity of patriarchal household structures would seem ludicrous to most of us today. But back then, in a socio-political landscape awash with conservative support, they seemed perfectly logical to a lot of people. Taken to an extreme, this kind of social dynamic reflects that often all it takes is for people to feel desperate, helpless, and unheard of enough before both men and women will agree to believe in and comply with the most outrageous of ideas and actions, especially when served on a religiously packaged silver platter, which is exactly what happens in Handmaid. By the way, guys, if you find this video helpful so far, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my top grade lit study content going forward. I'd also encourage you to check out my membership program by clicking the join button below if you want exclusive access to members only study content and make special video requests. I'll see you there. A particularly striking moment that illustrates the tremendously mind-bending power of pseudo-religious ritualism comes in chapters 15 and 16, when the euphemistically named ceremony takes place at the commander's household, where the commander, his wife Serena Joy, and his handmaid Offred engage in their monthly intercourse ritual for the purpose of procreation. What is in fact an intimate, private sexual act is turned into a mock liturgical ceremony akin to a Eucharistic Mass, where the commander is characterized as the celebrant directing the worship, and his wife Serena Joy, a sort of deacon who assists him in the ultimate act of consummation with his handmaid. So what supposedly a sacred formality is instead reduced to a utilitarian abomination. But the fake piety of it all is what makes the whole affair so unsavory to us outsiders and readers, yet so intoxicating to the insiders in the story, as the following moment shows. What's interesting about the Bible motif here is that it's a text only meant to be read to from it by him, who is the commander, but not by the handmaids themselves. It is deemed an incendiary device, suggesting the notion of the scripture as a kind of weapon, yet weaponizable only when exploited by someone in power. The Bible, as a metonym for religion per se, is not in itself a pernicious force. It is, when locked up and packaged as an ornate brass-bound leather-covered box, just a mere object that to the uninitiated seem little else than a decorative item. Yet it seems so incendiary precisely because of the cloaked-off, mysterious aura that locking it up creates around it, and because, well, Offred and her powerless ilk are told that it is an incendiary thing which they should stay clear away from. And who's to challenge the premise of whether the Bible is truly dangerous or if it's just as harmless as a bedtime story? The contradictory claims about the nature of scripture, then, highlights just how arbitrary and unreliable information can be in an autocratic society like Gilead, where people, especially the powerless ones like the handmaids, are expected to simply accept whatever they are told at any given point, and to numb themselves to jarring contradictions despite the illogicality of the claims. And indeed, the more they are indoctrinated with the same rituals, be it listening to the commander's sermons or copulating with him, the more these handmaids are expected to numb themselves with a self-drugging internal monologue that suppresses all rational judgment, even while the scriptural passages that the commander reads out are doctored and reappropriated for their own selfish purposes. Offred's narrative, however, shows that deep down, she retains a defiant streak that enables her to see through the monkey business of it all, despite her inability to speak against it openly. To justify the legitimacy of the ceremony, then, the commander must read out these selected and redacted passages from the Old Testament, with the idea that whatever ghastly action can be justified simply by deferring to so-called scriptural authority, a lot of which is made up anyway. Frankly, the ceremony is at best a biological engineering project for the most desperate of married couples, a sort of perverse IVF procedure, and at worst, legalized rape masquerading as a consensual threesome. But by glossing over the ugliness of it all, with the trappings of religious ritualism, which the very act of sermonizing is one example of, this creates distraction enough for most people to ignore the nonsensicality and immorality of it all. And when coupled with sharp reminders of the handmaid's material dependent on the powers that be, i.e. the porridge with cream and brown sugar, which they are lucky enough to be eating in an environment where there's already food scarcity, then that just reinforces that slavishness these handmaids would feel towards their commanders, aunts, and the oppressive Gileadian state. So what this specific but hugely telling moment shows us then is that religion, whether it be its scriptures, ceremonies, or rituals, is often not the root of evil acts in the world, but rather it's the politicization and exploitation of religious structures and practices that lays bare the human heart of darkness. While the vision of this is hyperbolized in a dystopian light in this novel, such an impulse has historically played out time and again. From the burning of Joan of Arc at the stake for her so-called heresy in the 15th century, to the late 20th century lobbying of evangelical conservative politicians in 1980s America in service of anti-women agenda like pushing back against abortion rights and the ratification of the ERA, which only exacerbated with the electoral victory of a pro-religious conservatism president like Ronald Reagan in 1984. The mid-20th century was a period of sharp cognitive dissonance for a lot of people who either lived through or at least witnessed the aftermath of World War II. Events like the Holocaust, the Bengal famine, and the rise of autocratic regimes reinforced the dark truth about human nature, how ghastly it could be when self-interest, ego, and despair were pushed to the brink, and how societies could collapse into inhumane, authoritarian regimes when morality no longer mattered in the public consciousness. This applied to both religious and secular states, as evidenced in the spurt of totalitarian and theocratic states like Stalinist Russia in the 1940s and the Islamic Republic of Iran in the 1980s. Indeed, in the final historical notes section of the novel, we know from one of Professor Peixoto's conference papers titled Iran and Gilead, Two Late 20th Century Monotheocracies, that Gilead is designed to be an autocratic state. But of course, the irony is that it's not really a theocracy as in the sense of rule by God, because the religiosity in Gilead is, as I've illustrated in the first context point earlier, a sham pseudo-religion used as a structural cover for the pursuit of lust and power. And in fact, this model of adopting an ideological superstructure to legitimize the seeking of base human desires is a staple across all autocratic regimes, where the head of state, be it Hitler in Nazi Germany, Stalin in Soviet Union, the Ayatollah Khomeini in the Islamic Republic of Iran, or even the ubiquitous Big Brother in the fictional 1984's Oceania, will be the de facto god who calls the shots in every aspect of civilian life. But if there's any hope, history has shown us that such autocracies never last, largely because the human desire for autonomy and freedom resides in every individual. And despite one staying silent about their dissenting thoughts, such thoughts will always be present, growing ever stronger the more they are suppressed. Ultimately then, rebellion begins in the mind, as we see at the start of the Praeviganza service in chapter 34, when Offred reduces the solemn-looking commander to a base, humiliating state in her imagination. The military uniform with sober black, rows of insignia and decorations invokes the figure of Hitler, who is almost never seen not in his Schutzstaffel wear and swastika. Yet despite the outward solemnity of the commander, he is promptly recast in the pathetic and disgusting simile of an animal fertilizing away like mad, like a rotting salmon. That he has to pretend to take no pleasure in the sexual act also suggests an animalistic inclination, since only humans copulate for pleasure and reasons other than reproduction. But of course, sexual pleasure is taboo in Gilead. But we know from Offred's own experiences with the commander and his requests for her to have sex and play Scrabble purely for romance that this artificial taboo goes against basic human nature. Under their intimidating facade, the commanders and those with the greatest power actually crave to have their deepest, rawest desires validated by another human being. And just like those they deem beneath them in social power or stature, these commanders and rulers have the same set of base needs as every other person, i.e. eat, sleep, defecate, and fornicate. Could use simpler words, but YouTube is going to ban this video. Anyway, stripped of their power-signifying plumage, these commanders are just another sex-hungry primate, slavish to the women whom they must fornicate with to achieve the sexual satisfaction that they so crave. Note Offred's biting sarcasm in her rhetorical question, when the Lord said be fruitful and multiply, did he mean this man? which is especially satisfying for the reader because we see that the moral puritanism that the Galilean ruling class supposedly subscribes to is nothing more than hypocrisy designed to shame women into mute subservience. But of course, we know that the women are not mute or subservient, at least not as long as they still have the freedom to think, which Offred clearly does. In any case, neither the commanders nor their wives care for moral purity, as their willing participation in the ceremony and the commanders' night outs with their handmaids at the Jezebel nightclub shows, while the aunts are seen to uphold this tenet of supposed sexual virtue out of envy, spite, and crude self-protective instincts. Now, one reason as to why Handmaid is such a refreshing and empowering novel, I suspect, is that Offred's vivid narrative of remembrance, reimagination, and redefinition uncovers a surprising yet hugely inspiring insight, which is that sweet victory against even the most monstrous, powerful political states can be gained entirely within the locus of one's mind. And once you have enough people activating their creative, defiant imaginations against the autocratic state and its perpetrators, that is when a groundswell of revolutionary dissent starts taking on a life of its own, as this later moment reflects. The notion that even whispering obscenities about those in power is like a spell suggests that any individual, as long as their cognitive faculties allow them to imagine and think things as they wish, possesses the agency to triumph over their oppressors, even if such triumph is not manifested openly in legitimate structures of power. Indeed, as Offred reflects, even the mere idea of Aunt Lydia doing such a thing as waving a rebellion flag from the hilltop was in itself heartening. And this is perhaps why Atwood has said that a primary inspiration for Handmaid's narrative style is the specific genre of the literature of witness, which is the kind of memoir-like writing where victims of trauma, oppression, or injustice write down their experiences for posterity. In documenting even these micro moments of mental rebellion, Offred demonstrates the power that one's mind possesses in subverting against external structures of oppression, and inspires others to see beyond their objective state of victimhood, as these handmaids are shown to be in, and to reimagine themselves as victors by simultaneously reimagining their oppressors as brutish clowns and these ignominious failures with flaccid cocks like 3-week-old carrots. Ouch, but you go, girl. And there you go, guys. That's my analysis on the two main contextual influences that I see overarching The Handmaid's Tale, specifically on the politicization of religion and the religiosity of politics throughout human history. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these ideas and how you view their relationship with Atwood's book. So please comment below and we can get the discussion started. For your next video, I recommend that you watch my analysis on whether Handmaid can really be called a feminist novel, which will give you a unique insight into the ideas of gender and womanhood. Now hit that thumbs up button below if you found this video helpful in any way, so that the YouTube algorithm will know to spread it to other passionate lit learners like yourself all around the world, and that you can encourage me to keep making these useful study videos for you going forward. Please also subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that bell notification below so you never miss out on my future weekly videos. You can also consider joining my membership program for exclusive video requests and essay review perks. You can click the join button below to find out more. And as always, I will see you in the next one.